Mike Pence, a former senior US diplomat, recently claimed that the US ran a media campaign against Prime Minister Modi in the 2019 elections. I mean, so did the UK with the BBC and other media outlets. Now, as we approach the 2024 elections, we see Western governments and Western media repeating that same pattern. We had that scandalous anti Modi documentary by the BBC recently. Every Western index ranks India close to the bottom. I mean, whether it's democracy, freedom of religion, minority rights, it's almost as if they've not heard of the concentration camps of Uyghur Muslims in China. Somehow that just doesn't count. So they seem to ignore all this wonderful progress that India has made, particularly since Modi ji came to power, and project the country as a backward and oppressive, and only grudgingly accept that it's now the fifth largest economy in the world and completely democratic. So I guess the question is, why all this negativity against India, particularly leading up to the elections? If we try to connect the dots, one could say that these are suspiciously regime change tactics or similar to regime change tactics that are being employed. What are your thoughts on this?
I think I want to weigh in on that just because I did an analysis on that for the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference. And to me, that was very clear. When I was doing that analysis, like I said, there was this whole concept of, how the caste calculus in India is not working as well. And they're not able to create those, small factions of voting blocks, right? That was a discussion point very strongly that came out during my sentiment analysis. And it shows that they want to bring back that whole, division based on caste, based on tribes that used to exist, which allows both for, the election processes for them, where, say the Yadavs and the Muslims vote together, or the tribals in the Northeast and in certain parts are easy to convert. So those were points of discussion during the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference. And as you can see that even now, the caste discussion is growing in India as well. You see Bihar is trying to hold a caste census. There was heavy pressure on the central government to reinstate the caste census. After years, after 1931, I think there was no more any talk of caste census. It was banned. But now there is this idea of resurfacing it. And why is that? Obviously, there is a concern that there is a dilution of the caste identity. And as far as I could see from the analysis, there were two things that came about. What is Hindutva according to these Breaking India forces? And that is two things. One is when the caste calculus breaks, that in itself is, according to them, Hindutva and the rise of Hindutva. And secondly, when we try to define ourselves, whether academically, whether in our media discourses, when the Hindus try to define themselves, or the tribals, how they should behave, or how there is a certain level of growing civilizational identity, that to them is Hindutva. So the idea that you put forward that there is an attempt to influence the elections in India is absolutely clear in that conference and in the narrative that is going on in the media even at this time. So I do totally agree. I can give one last case that I saw recently at the IITs, where one Dalit boy committed suicide. And there was a big story the media played out for 3 months saying that there is, again, caste oppression in the IITs. And then it was found out that his a Muslim roommate actually pressured him into committing suicide because a suicide note was found from this boy, Dalit boy, and it showed that he was influenced by this Muslim boy to commit suicide. So, because of his aggression, rather. But what I'm trying to say is there is a absolutely clear attempt to make caste narratives, even in films and in media discourse, obviously.
The Equality Lab report is bogus. Caste definition is wrong. and there's no evidence of widespread caste discrimination. Yet we still have this law, SB 403, going through the system, and from what you've said, Richard G, sounds like it's going to get passed. It's very odd. It just doesn't make any sense at all. Panditji, do you have any concluding thoughts on this? You know, the whole what Richard G has just said, and the sort of narrative that's being spun, and how legislation is being pushed through the system without any evidence.
Richard's contribution just then is actually very, very important, and I'd just like to pick up on one or two points of that. You also made a note about the manner in which India is being tarnished and criticized on the basis of this caste. You know, caste has been the whip with which those who enslaved Bharat, with which they have been whipping the Hindu civilization for the best part of 250 years. You know, there's such a lot of investment which has gone in to maintaining this trope, and they're not going to let go of it lightly. If I can pick up on what Richaji was saying, economically and geopolitically, you know, we are witnessing the end of what I call the colonization dividend. You know, a huge amount of wealth, power, and resources was stolen under acts which are horrifically violent, and that capital gave rise to the Western world as we know it. It wasn't wealth that was produced indigenously. It wasn't economic GDP growth that was created by the efforts of the populations from the colonizer countries. It was a colonizer dividend, and that's now virtually depleted. The economic models that these nations used were probably best described, I would thought, as mercenary economics. The product that you have to export is discord, strife, and then on the basis of disputes that you've been participating in the fabrication of, you then provide weapons to both parties, and you need a justification to do that. And we have seen this time and time again. We saw a completely false justification in the case of Iraq. Do you remember those illusory weapons of mass destruction that never turned up? A little bit like the illusory casteism, which never turned up in the Cisco case. And yet, a lot of harm was done. Bharat, on the other hand, has demonstrated a completely different economic model. You know, it has, in the short space of 9 or 10 years, created an economic miracle, and it has done so without exporting an iota of suffering. I'd bring everyone's attention to the fact that even when the pandemic was running and wreaking havoc, India, Prime Minister Modi's government refused to make profit out of it, refused to take a gain on the basis of the suffering of other human beings. 67 countries received vaccines without India having made a profit out of any one of those vaccine sales. Compare and contrast that to Pfizer, which was imposing draconian commercial terms to project power, demanding military bases in some cases. Totally different economic model. So India's recovery has actually been an entirely dharmic recovery. India's demonstrated that when human beings act together to support each other, unbelievable economic advance is possible. This is a threat to the nations that insist on playing the great game. You know, I referred to that mercenary economics. We saw it in Ukraine. Who are the biggest losers in that? The Ukrainians. The Ukrainian nation has become a battlefield. And once this mercenary economic policy has been exhausted there, we're seeing the next battleground being prepared in Taiwan. You know, a case will be made for it. And in the same way, a case is being made against India. And the case is that India is not capable of running its own affairs. It's not capable of ensuring equality and equity for all of its citizens. And so we need external impetus. It's that classic element which was pervasive in colonization. The white man's burden. We know better what's good for you. Even if it means killing you, we'll kill you, but it will be for your good. You know, that is the heart of many of these policies. And India is large enough, substantial enough, that without internal friction, India would actually be contributing a vision to the world on how human beings and nations can coexist, which is totally the opposite of everything that the colonizer dividend and the colonizer powers have invested themselves in. So it's a civilizational threat. There are two ways in which human beings can exist on this planet. One is the dharmic one, and the other is purely adharmic. It's purely asuric. It's built on suffering, it's built on devastation, it's built on overconsumption, it's built on illness, it's built on strife, it's built on fear, it's built on ultimately enslavement. And so India is a threat to those principles. We will see so much more of the every single trope will be used to attack India over the next few weeks. June the 22nd is coming up. Prime Minister Modi, who is visiting the United States, I suspect he will be welcomed by a deluge of tropes, by accusations of Godra 2002 will be resurrected, and it will be resurrected by nations which feel not the slightest bit of shame and guilt that one, Tony Blair, the butcher of Baghdad, as he was known by many people, is still walking free. George Bush, still walking free. No human rights allegations have been brought against them. The International Criminal Court is not pursuing any action against them. And yet they're waxing lyrical against President Putin, against Prime Minister Modi, and against other nations. You know, there once was a principle that people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. But it seems as though this particular group have thrown so many stones that their own glasses are about to crumble and crash in on them. And that is the consequence and the outcome of what we're seeing at the moment. So absolutely agree with Richaji's assessment there and her data analytics, and indeed your analysis of the geopolitics of the situation.
So, as we come to the conclusion of this discussion, what would you say to Hindus who are observing all these events and getting concerned about the trajectory and where that might lead? Because there is no Hindu country in the world. I mean, India is secular, and that's the closest thing we have. So, on a practical level, what would you say Hindus should do? Hindus all over the world.
Well, I have a very simple response. If you don't engage in politics, you deserve to be ruled by complete idiots. And I think that is probably a word for every single Hindu to take on board. Please engage yourself in all of these processes. You know, democracy is an incredible opportunity. It's one of the few systems whereby people can actually get rid of people in positions of power. And if there's something that is causing a problem, then you need to get rid of that particular problem. And if you're not fully engaged in the democratic process in India, then be prepared for those who are engaged to have their views and their societal frameworks imposed upon you. You know, it gives me a great deal of dissatisfaction when I hear the results of Karnataka and places like that in India, where the Hindu vote is so lethargic and apathetic by its absence. It's just a terrible, terrible waste of an incredible opportunity. So every Hindu everywhere should be making sure that they get out and that they vote, that they engage in the democratic discourse, and that they make their views known whilst they still have the opportunity. And that time is limited.
And get involved in this conference.
That goes without saying, but thank you for mentioning it again.
Richardji, do you have any concluding thoughts or advice to give to Hindus in this, with all these events that have unfolded?
Absolutely. I mean, I would like to say very clearly that there is an attempt to recolonize us. You know, the idea that caste, Dalit, and Adivasi, these three terms, which are colonial terms, have resurfaced, and they have resurfaced in not just India, but more so in the diaspora. And the whole idea there is, I do see a direct connection, like I said, to this whole dismantling global Hindutva conference, because the idea that they feel is that suddenly there is a revivalism of the Hindu identity in the global, diaspora as well. So the idea that these three terms, which were invented in the British colonized times in the 1900s, early 1900s, and have nothing to do with Hinduism, have nothing to do with our scriptures, The Dalits were identified, if you study them closely, as those who were most impacted by the British extraction economy. And they became the Dalits of India, really. The Adivasi term is actually the Vanavasis. Many of these tribes also were strong Rajput tribes or those criminal tribes who were hunted down during the British times. So those ideas should no longer be applicable. And if they're being imposed onto us through policy, these terms were, introduced in the Seattle law, and we fought it and got rid of them. And in SB 403 as well, in the initial draft, shows the illicit motive to institute these terminology and make them mainstream. So we really are fighting a very big battle, but we are safeguarded by the American Constitution because it is a very beautiful constitution and it definitely protects us from that standpoint. And of course, I want to put a plug here for castfiles.com that covers a lot of these issues, that brings these sort of discourses to the mainstream, the alternative voice, the subaltern voice, which is definitely not covered in the media. I want to clearly point out here that our voice has been completely subverted in mainstream media. We have been interviewed by big media houses like NPR, which is public radio, where I have in the past donated. And it's also been subverted when Dalits speak to mainstream media. Those interviews are not carried out and not published. So Dalits who are fighting the caste imposition of caste consciousness and caste policy, that voice is being subverted. So obviously there is an agenda and we are continuing to fight it. So caste conference, July 16th, please watch out.
Brilliant. Panditji, do you have, if we wanted to end on a positive note, would you have any salutary advice to give to us that would, let us close this discussion feeling optimistic?
Well, how does one follow up what Richa has just contributed? I'm also going to do one small thing. A second edition of my book on caste will also be launching, and hopefully it will be available just before the book, before the conference itself. But everybody should recognize that, if you look at the level of incompetence of the people who have engaged in this act of propaganda and hate, it should give us a great deal of confidence, because people who are infused with hatred tend not to be particularly clear thinking. They tend to be a little bit erratic, and more often than not, what happens is that their own actions cause the edifices that they build to collapse inwards on top of them. And we're beginning to see this. The response of the Attorney General in the United States, which was based on the Constitution, clearly identified that the CRD had acted in a manner which was outside of due process and legality. And that's a devastating indictment of the level of incompetence of these people. So on the one hand, the edifices are ready to fall, and they always are. But on the other hand, they only tumble when people who have got goodness in their heart, who want nothing except happiness, joy, and prosperity for everybody else, get involved and get engaged. In the our concluding elements of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishnaji makes it really clear to Arjuna that even if on the battlefield you have the undefeated Narayani Sena facing you on the other side of the battlefield, all that's required is for you to act in the best interests of everybody else. But act you must. And if everybody acts, and we're encouraging them to act, we're encouraging them to act with those people who've chosen to act in the conference, with those people like Richaji who've chosen to do the data analytics and present irrefutable evidence. These are all actions of good people coming together for the benefit of all of the citizens. And so it's a straightforward response. Yata ichasi tata kuru. I couldn't give a better piece of advice than that. It doesn't matter what you do, so long as you do something within your abilities, within your limits, and within the scope of what you can actually bear, you must do something. And if you do, we look forward to not just a victory, but perhaps even a step forward in the relationships between the global human family. Vasudeva Kutumbakam is not a reality until we all make it so. So that would be my word of encouragement. Please do engage. And as I said in one of the talks that I gave whilst I was over in the United States, Yudh mein bhi anand hai. For Kshatriyas, there is anand in engaging robustly with the injustices that are being faced. And so I'd recommend that most highly.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.